Hi, this is Masadi from Olympian High School. We've been using the Traditions and Encounters textbook, specifically Chapter 9, to learn about classical India. So we've just learned that there were two major centralized states in India during the classical period. We've only learned about one so far, the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryan Empire, we learned in the last video, has fallen. Regional kingdoms are going to develop and create order for a while. And then we'll see one more attempt at a really strong centralized state with the Gupta dynasty before we spend the next millennium of time, so 1,000 years, with regional kingdoms and no large centralized state until the arrival of the Mughals in the 16th century CE, or the 1500s. So again, we had the Mauryan dynasty founded by Chandragupta Maurya in the 320s BCE, and we're going to pick up with the fall of that empire around the 180s BCE and the creation of two important regional kingdoms. These are not the only kingdoms that existed in history at that time. We're just looking at two, okay, the two most influential ones. So if you continue your studies on South Asia and India, you'll learn about other regional kingdoms. Okay, so let's talk about the Kingdom of Bactria. I mentioned where Bactria was in the previous video. Bactria is where we think of as Afghanistan and Pakistan today. So it's a northwestern part of India, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And in that region, a group of Greek-speaking people are going to come and mix with the Indian population. So we have this fascinating blend, this syncretism of Indian and Greek culture. These Greek people were descendants of Alexander of Macedon's successors who had come to India so long ago. And they invaded, I believe, around 182 BCE. You want to think of Bactria as being a very successful commercial center and site during that time. So the road between the Bactrian city of Taxila linked India to other important trade lands and helped this state become very wealthy. So think of it as being an intriguing state because of the cultural syncretism that's happening between two very different groups of people, and because it's an important site for trade. It makes for a wealthy regional kingdom. So that's what this slide on the left is saying, and you'll read about the Kingdom of Bactria on the right. Now, much later, you're going to have that Kingdom of Bactria being attacked by a group of nomadic conquerors from Central Asia. And these are a group of people that are called the Kushans, not to be confused with the Kingdom of Kush in Africa, okay? So you need to know for your exam when you're doing your inspect chart about their most prominent or important ruler, Kanishka. He's going to expand the empire to make it include larger territory from all the way from northern India to an area called Gujarat. And just like the Bactrian kingdom that preceded it, the Kushans will also facilitate trade. So if you speak Spanish, the word fácil, right, something easy, to make something easy, to make it possible. So to make trade easier. Specifically, they participated in the Silk Roads trade network, which we'll be studying a lot in chapter 12. But this was a network of both overland and sea routes that connected a large part of the world at this time. And as you can assume by the name, one of the most important items, commodities being traded, was silk from China. And so there's this participation in the Silk Roads, largely because the Kushans pacified, the word paz, make peace, pacified these trade networks, made it safe for merchants to travel. Okay, so there were other states around at that time and different rulers that tried to copy or replicate what the Mauryans had done. But the only state that came close to being as powerful as the Mauryan Empire was the Gupta dynasty. So we've learned about the Bactrian kingdom and the Kingdom of Kush. Remember, these are people from Central Asia. Later in time, in the Kingdom of Bactria, they participated in the Silk Roads network. And now we're going to look at this last dynasty that had a chance of creating a long period of centralized imperial, but it doesn't last. There are going to be so many similarities to the first empire I mentioned, the one that actually created a large imperial state, the Mauryan dynasty. So for example, the Mauryan Empire started in the 320s BCE, and the Gupta dynasty starts in the 320s CE. Both are formed by Chandragupta. The Mauryan dynasty starts by Chandragupta Maurya, and the Gupta dynasty started by Chandragupta, not related at all. Okay, so this is interesting. And both are going to be based in that really successful agricultural region of Magadha near the Ganges River Valley. And here it's telling you some differences. It was smaller in size than the earlier Mauryan Empire, and it was extremely different in how they governed and how they administered. So much more decentralized style. In the book, you can read a little bit about this. You can read about how they forged alliances with different families. You can read about the successors to Chandragupta. So successors are people that come after, succeed, not succeed like I'm successful, but succeed like I come after. Both the earlier Mauryan dynasty and the Gupta dynasty ruled from the capital of Pataliputra. You'll read about them establishing tributary alliances with the states around them. I mentioned that it was smaller and that they ruled differently. So if we think about Ashoka, Ashoka was ruling at the height of the earlier Mauryan dynasty. It was a very centralized state. Not so with the Guptas. The Guptas instead left a lot of the administration and governance in the hands of their allies, their political friends that ruled different regions for them. That will be problematic because these people are kind of more independent. And so when eventually they're attacked from outside, which they will be, they'll be attacked from outside, that empire is going to splinter apart or break apart into the different administrative regions. It splinters along the fault lines. There's like there's an earthquake and it breaks up into little pieces based on who's administering which part. Okay, so this tells you a little bit more about how there was a Buddhist that traveled here during this time and survived it as a very safe land. The Guptas were also supporters of advanced studies, particularly in science and math. They had invented techniques of plastic surgery, they had astronomers, and they were especially admired for their mathematics and their ability to manipulate numbers using a symbol for zero. The Arabs and Persian scholars, when they later learned about all the cool things that Indian scholars were doing with math, were interested and embraced this mathematics. And what's funny is the Europeans later learned about this math from the Arabs. And so they called these numbers Arabic numerals, Arabic numbers, but they weren't Arabic at all. They actually were Hindi numerals from the Indians that they had learned about them. So this process of diffusion taking place. Okay, so as I mentioned, eventually the Guptas will be attacked by nomadic people called the White Huns, very similar to what we saw in chapter 8 with the attacks of the Shan Yu on the Han Dynasty. And again, because of the more decentralized style of the Gupta dynasty, you're going to see a splintering of the Gupta dynasty as the Huns attack. So some of the later Gupta emperors are not even recorded by the imperial documents, okay? And it's not until much later, until the 1500s, so the 16th century CE, do we see a return of an imperial government. And by that I mean a strong centralized government where there's an empire that's ruling. Okay, so you've learned a little bit about the two regional kingdoms that succeeded or came after the Mauryan dynasty and about the Gupta dynasty and how it was similar to and different from the Mauryan dynasty. And we learned about the White Huns. And oh, I forgot to mention what happens after the Gupta dynasty falls. Small local kingdoms will try to bring some kind of order to India, to the subcontinent, until the Mughal Empire is finally formed, and then we'll see a revival of empire.